innovation or novelties which succeeded. Right? Innovations are of the range of possible new combinations or new institutions. It's those that actually take off. If you're going to have any serious innovation policy, it has to incorporate the risk associated with novelty. The vast majority of novelties fail. Any discussion of those that succeeded is necessarily kind of lying on top of this invisible underwater kind of iceberg of novelties that necessarily fail.
Innovation can be talked about in terms of things that succeed or have social value, but I think when we look around at the use of the term more generally, what we see is a kind of covering law gesture of validity. So if you talk about something being innovative, if you say that your institution is dedicated to innovation, if you have an office of innovation at your university or your firm, these are all presumptively good things. And I think it's important to question that because, yes, there are things that succeed, and we can talk about what counts as success. Although even there, it seems to me that our definitions tend to be very narrowly instrumental. Success in terms of, say, economic growth or economic progress are not necessarily good in measured by other metrics. But even if we have that discussion, we haven't yet had the discussion about the use of the term innovation, the ideology of innovation. And that's what mostly concerns me, because it seems to me that it's become this self-justifying term within contemporary discourse. And I think that really needs some pushback. It's closely allied, though, again, not exactly identical with the ideology of technology, because there, once again, we can distinguish between technologies that we find useful or pleasant and the idea of technology, which is, in brief, the idea that everything is instrumental, everything is a tool. The entire world is, as Heidegger said, standing reserve, waiting to be used up by us. And so that's the note that I would like to strike just as part of this discussion. Let's question the use of the term innovation whenever it comes up. Sometimes it's used in fully justifiable ways. Other times, take Peter Thiel as an example. I guess this must be the innovation conference version of Godwin's Law. How long does it take before Peter Thiel's name comes up rather than Hitler's? This is a guy who is using the ideology of innovation as a justification for far right-wing anarchist political agenda and dramatic deregulation and undermining of the very idea of government. Now that is a terrible, terrible way for the ideology of innovation to be deployed, in my opinion, and we can argue about it. But it's not about the specific things that his companies might generate. It's about the way the world is conceived by somebody like that with the power that he has to destroy an independent media outlet like Gawker, for example, just because he didn't like something that they said about one of his friends.
I mean, sure. I mean, I like the idea that it's true. The idea that the world is a standing reserve, suggests that we don't value those elements on their own. Although I would say, with the last Peter Thiel remark, I mean, I couldn't agree more that there is power, in the hands of those who have kind of like profited from innovation and the idea of innovation. But I would say that disruptions of a whole host of types are associated with innovation, and our taste for disruption and our taste for failure end up being necessarily associated with the likelihood that we're going to identify kind of new peaks in this kind of landscape of fitnesses. And those peaks, could be technological, and they could be social, and they could be a whole host of different things. And whether we like them or whether we don't like them, in that sense, I completely agree that the ideology that innovation is always a good thing should definitely be questioned. And yet, at the same time, associating the fact that many of these different types of kind of anarchies and chaoses and risks essentially are are necessary for exploring good possibilities as well as bad possibilities. I mean, to get a lot of successes, you need a lot of failures. If you have an innovation center and you don't have a failure rate that's like 80% plus, then you won't find anything in that space. And in fact, that's one of the problems with, if you think about a novelty policy, you think about scientists. Scientists are tiny firms. They have no slack effectively. I mean, maybe they can subsist on the fat of the state and grants for some time. But I think the fact is they behave in enormously conservative ways because of the lack of capital they have to build a portfolio to kind of engage in a wide range of behaviors. And so we see actually, in some sense, much less risk and much less innovation in that sector than we might otherwise imagine.
Thinking about failure and how to, reward or punish failure in the way in which we think about innovation process is extremely important in order to have the right level and the right direction of innovation activity. So in economics, we've been, thinking a lot about, for example, how to reward scientists, how to pay scientists, what is the best way to pay scientists in an organization. And you know that, giving too much risk to scientists is not good because, innovation is extremely risky and is extremely uncertain. At the same time, we also know that it is very hard to have an effective innovation process if you just completely, don't consider the fact that scientists and innovators may not be rewarded for their success.
I'm writing a book right now about baseball. Baseball is about failure. It's a game that's rife with failure. The cliches are you probably all heard them if you spend any time watching baseball. The best hitters in the history of the game fail 6 times out of 10, or even 7 times out of 10. There is such a thing as a perfect game, but it's so rare that you can list the number of pitchers who've achieved that on a few hands. And so I decided to call my book Fail Better, which is a part of a quotation from Beckett in Westward Ho. He says, ever tried, ever failed, try again, fail better. And one of the things I found when I was researching in Silicon Valley, this is a mantra, fail better. And I think that actually is really very productive, because if you take that idea seriously, then it's not just the percentages, 80% failure rate. It's the idea that everything is less than it could be, because we're at the limits of what we can do at any given moment. And so we keep trying, and yeah, maybe we get a little bit better. And that notion, I think, is very powerful, because it seems to me strongly aligned with, say, the idea of falsifiability in scientific propositions. They're not ideological. By definition, Popper says if something is falsifiable, then it's not ideological, because you can give the conditions under which it can be shown to be false. And that is the key distinction. Something that's ideological has no falsifiability. It's always and everywhere true because someone believes it.